The chart spoke first. I was reviewing lab results at the nurses' station on the fourth floor of Hargrove Memorial Medical Center when the front desk called up. It was a Tuesday morning in late October, and I had been chief of internal medicine for 3 years. The call came the way routine calls always do, flat, professional, without ceremony. Dr. Miriam Osaibansu, there's a walk-in requesting a consultation. No appointment, says it's a family matter. I recognized the name on the registration form before she recognized the title on my door. Diane Calloway, my sister. She was sitting in the consultation waiting area with her son, Carter, who was 17 now and looked like he had grown 4 inches since the last time I'd been forced to share a table with him at our mother's birthday dinner. Diane was wearing the kind of performance grief clothing people wear when they want everyone in a room to know they have suffered, dark blouse, no jewelry, the deliberate blankness of someone practicing an expression. She hadn't looked up yet. She was scrolling her phone with one thumb, the way she always did when she wanted to appear unconcerned while actually cataloging every detail of her surroundings. I set down the lab results. I straightened the ID badge clipped to my white coat, the one that read Dr. Miriam Osibonsu, Chief of Internal Medicine, and I walked toward the waiting area with the same unhurried pace I used when I was about to deliver news that would change the shape of someone's life. She looked up when I was 4 feet away. I watched her eyes travel from my face to my coat to the badge and back to my face. The sequence took approximately 2 seconds. In those 2 seconds, I saw something move across her expression that she didn't have time to control, something that was not quite recognition, because she had never seen this version of me, and not quite shock, because shock implies you had a prior estimate that turned out to be wrong. What crossed Diane Calloway's face was the particular vertigo of a person discovering that the map they've been using for 20 years was never accurate. Miriam, she said. Dr. Osaibansu, I said, not as a correction. As a fact, hello, everyone. Before I continue, if you've ever been told you would never amount to anything by someone who should have believed in you, leave a comment below. I want to hear your story. Because what I'm about to tell you is not really about medicine, or inheritance, or even the things my sister did at my husband's funeral with a face full of manufactured grief, and a claim she had been rehearsing for years. It is about what happens when you decide, very quietly, to become undeniable. But to understand why that moment in the waiting room meant what it did, why I felt nothing that looked like triumph and everything that looked like completion, I have to take you back. 22 years back. To a house on Marston Road in Colville, Ohio, where a 19-year-old girl was told, very clearly, that she did not have what it took. I was the second of 3 children. My mother, Gloria Calloway, was a bookkeeper with precise handwriting and no patience for ambition she couldn't immediately price. My father, Raymond Calloway, died when I was 11, and after that my mother ran the household the way she ran her ledgers, in columns, with losses clearly marked. My older sister Diane was 22 that year, already married to a man named Patrick Sowers who owned a small property management company, and in my mother's accounting system, Diane occupied the asset column. She had done everything correctly. She had married someone with a business. She had produced a child, a boy named Carter, within 18 months. She was, by every measure my mother recognized, a success. I was the liability. I had been accepted, at 19, to the pre-medicine track at Crestfield University in Cincinnati. The acceptance letter arrived in early April, and I made the mistake of reading it aloud at the dinner table. Diane set down her fork. Pre-med, she said, the way you'd say professional clown. My mother looked at the letter the way she looked at repair estimates, searching for the number that would end the conversation. The number was $42,000. That was the annual cost of attendance at Crestfield, before books, before housing, before the incidental fees that universities bury in the fine print. My mother had $8,000 in savings. My father's life insurance had paid out $60,000 8 years earlier, and I knew, without asking, that most of it was gone. There is a community college 11 minutes from this house, my mother said. She folded the letter and slid it back across the table to me. 2 years there and you transfer, it's the same degree at the end. It's not the same degree, I said. And it's not the same path. Pre-med needs a research environment. I need labs. I need faculty who are publishing. You need to be realistic, Diane said. She wasn't angry. She was something worse than angry. She was bored by my ambition, the way adults are bored by a child's fantasy about becoming an astronaut. Doctors come from money, Miriam. We don't have money, that's not a tragedy, that's just a fact. Dad's insurance, Dad's insurance paid the mortgage and the property taxes for 4 years, my mother said very quietly. Don't. There was a silence that lasted long enough to mean something permanent. I picked up the letter. I folded it back the way it had come. I put it in the pocket of my jeans, and I went upstairs, and I did not cry until the door was closed. The following week, my mother told me she would contribute $6,000 toward 2 years at Colville Community College, where I could start practical. Diane, in a gesture of sisterly generosity, she mentioned twice at every subsequent family gathering, offered to let me babysit Carter twice a week in exchange for what she called a small household contribution, $40 per session, which she deducted from a notional loan she had apparently decided I owed her. I never received a single check. The $40 went, she explained, toward her costs for feeding me at Sunday dinners I had not requested. The total value of what was denied to me that April, the gap between Crestfield's financial aid package and what my family would contribute, was $44,000 over 4 years. I did not have a number for it at the time. I calculated it later precisely, when I needed to understand what I was working against. I enrolled at Colville Community College in the fall. I took every science course they offered. I worked 12 hours a week at a pharmacy on Belgrove Avenue, and I kept a notebook where I tracked every application, every scholarship, every grant program I could find. On the first page of that notebook I had written, in the kind of handwriting you use when you want a thing to be permanent, Crestfield University School of Medicine, Internal Medicine Residency, Department Chief. I wrote the whole trajectory on one page. I folded the page and kept it in the front pocket of every bag I owned for the next 7 years. Diane, at Christmas that year, told me I was being dramatic. "You're not going to be a doctor," she said, not unkindly, which was the worst way to say it. "And that's okay. Not everyone is supposed to. Some people are supposed to be the ones who help doctors." I smiled. I helped her clear the plates. I went home and I scheduled my biology lab for the next semester. The first rejection came in February of my second year at Colville, from the Bellwether Medical Scholars Program, a competitive scholarship that funded 2 years of pre-med at an accredited 4-year university for community college students who met specific academic and essay criteria. I had a 3.97 GPA. I had 2 letters of recommendation from faculty who had written, independently, that they had rarely seen a student with my combination of analytical precision and patient curiosity. My essay was 12 drafts deep. I had never wanted anything as specifically as I wanted that scholarship. The rejection letter was 4 sentences. The 4th sentence was, "We encourage you to apply again in the following academic year." I sat in my car in the parking lot of the Colville Community Library for 45 minutes. I did not call anyone. There was no one to call who would have said the right thing. My mother would have used it as evidence. Diane would have used it as kindness, the "I told you so" wrapped in sympathy that is worse than the plain version. What I did, after 45 minutes, was drive to the campus of Fairbrook University, not Crestfield, not yet, but a 4-year school with a legitimate pre-med track 14 miles away, and I walked into the office of pre-professional advising and asked to speak to someone about transfer pathways. The administrative assistant, a young woman named Priya Subramanian who turned out to be a second-year biology major working the desk for work-study credit, looked at my Colville transcript and said, without any particular ceremony, "You should talk to Dr. Enkemdiram. She does transfer advising for the pre-med cohort. She's in on Thursday afternoons." Dr. Adiz Enkemdiram was an associate professor of cellular biology who had, years earlier, done her residency at the same program I had my eye on at Crestfield before moving into research and teaching. She was 51 years old, wore reading glasses on a beaded chain, and had the particular quality of attention that I later came to recognize as the hallmark of physicians who had made their peace with complexity. She listened not just to what you said, but to what you were deciding while you said it. I spent 40 minutes in her office that Thursday. I showed her my transcript, my application essays, my scholarship rejection, my notebook. She read the first page of the notebook, the one with the trajectory written out, without commenting on it, which I understood to mean she was taking it seriously. "You're going to reapply to Bellwether," she said, "but first you're going to apply for the Hartley Biomedical Grant through our department. It's not as large, It covers 1 semester, not 2 years, but it gets you on this campus with a faculty research assignment, and that gives you a publication-adjacent credit line before you apply to Crestfield directly. There's also a health insurance coverage provision for student researchers. You won't have to drop your pharmacy shifts immediately. The mention of health insurance coverage was the first time I had heard those words used in connection with my own professional path rather than as a source of anxiety. I wrote it down. 3 months later, I received the Hartley Biomedical Grant. The award was $11,000 plus the health insurance coverage provision. I transferred to Fairbrook University in September. I did not tell my mother until after the transfer was complete. I called her on a Sunday evening and told her I was enrolled in a 4-year pre-med program and that I had secured funding to cover the first semester. She said, "I hope you know what you're doing." I said, "I do." There was a pause. "Diane is pregnant again," my mother said. "Isn't that wonderful?" I said that it was. I hung up. I went back to studying. My first 2 years at Fairbrook were the years in which I learned that being the most determined person in the room was necessary but not sufficient. There were students in my cohort who were brilliant in ways that were different from my brilliance, faster at synthesis, more intuitive with spatial reasoning, effortlessly at ease in the social architecture of academic science that I had to learn like a second language. There was a moment in the spring of my junior year, sitting in the anteroom of the Fairbrook Pre-Med Advising Office waiting for my advisor to tell me whether my Crestfield application had what it needed, when I genuinely did not know. Not whether I would be accepted, whether I belonged. It lasted approximately 90 seconds. Then my advisor, Dr. Enkemdirim, who had by this point become the closest thing to a professional mentor I had ever had, came out of her office, saw my expression, and said, "Stop calculating the odds. You're going to make a terrible statistician and a very good physician. Come in." Crestfield University School of Medicine offered me full admission and a partial merit scholarship covering 60% of tuition for my first 2 years, with the balance covered by a combination of federal loans, a departmental grant, and 12 hours a week of teaching assistant work in the undergraduate biology program. I did not tell my family. Not because I wanted to withhold it, not yet, but because by then I had understood something important about my own momentum. The people who hadn't believed in me did not deserve to witness the early chapters of my becoming. Their acknowledgement would cost me something I wasn't willing to spend. My mother found out through a cousin who had seen my name in the Crestfield commencement program 4 years later, when I graduated with my medical degree and a distinction in internal medicine. She called me the day after graduation. She said she was proud, and I believed her, and I also knew that pride at the finish line was not the same as faith at the starting line, and that the difference between those two things was the entire story of my life up to that point. Diane found out the same way. She called 2 weeks after my mother. "So you actually did it," she said. "I did," I said. "That's great, Miriam, really, it's great." Then she asked me if I could look at a rash on Carter's arm the next time I was in Colville. She had been trying to get a specialist appointment for 3 weeks, and the earliest the pediatric specialist could see him was 6 weeks out. If I could just take a look, informally, as family, it would save them the wait. I told her I wasn't licensed yet. She made a sound that suggested she found this technicality unnecessarily rigid. I drove back to Cincinnati. The 6 years between my medical degree and my appointment as attending physician of internal medicine at Hargrove Memorial Medical Center were the most professionally formative years of my life, and almost none of them were visible to anyone in my family. I did my residency at Crestfield University Hospital, 3 years of internal medicine training that functioned, in practice, as a graduate-level education in human resilience, diagnostic precision, and the specific kind of exhaustion that teaches you what you actually value. My residency supervisor was Dr. Fenwick Adami, Chief of Internal Medicine at Crestfield University Hospital, a man of extraordinary clinical intelligence and exactly zero tolerance for imprecision. He reviewed patient charts the way a master watchmaker examines a mechanism, not searching for what worked, but listening for what didn't. In my second year, after I had correctly identified a misattributed diagnosis on a patient who had been admitted 3 times in 8 months without resolution, Dr. Adami pulled me aside after morning rounds and said, with the economy of a person who did not give unnecessary compliments. You hear what the chart says, not what the admitting physician wanted it to say. That is the most important clinical skill and the least teachable one. Don't lose it. I didn't lose it. I built everything on it. By the third year of my residency, I had co-authored 2 papers, one on atypical presentations of systemic inflammatory conditions in adult patients, and one on the correlation between incomplete medical records at point of care and adverse outcomes in internal medicine admissions. The second paper was cited 14 times in its first year. Dr. Ademi added me to a research committee. I presented at the Midwest Internal Medicine Symposium in March of 2011, 6 months before I completed my residency. I was 31 years old. I had $43,000 in federal loan debt. I had, very quietly, begun to understand what I was building and why. The moment I could have told my family came on a Wednesday evening in November, the year I completed my residency. My mother called to tell me that Diane's second husband, she had divorced Patrick Sowers 3 years earlier, was doing very well in real estate, and that they had just purchased investment property in a development east of Columbus. She mentioned this in the tone she used for things she considered to be evidence of correct life choices. "Are you still at the hospital?" she asked. "I completed my residency," I said. "I'm going to be accepting an attending position." "That's good," she said. "Diane's new development has 3 bedrooms and a sunroom." I said that sounded lovely. I did not mention the symposium. I did not mention the papers. I did not mention that Dr. Ademi had, that same week, recommended me directly to the medical director at Hargrove Memorial Medical Center for their open attending position, a recommendation that came with his personal phone call, which, in the professional architecture of academic medicine, was as significant as anything that had ever happened to my career. She had no idea what I had become. None of them did, and I had every intention of keeping it that way. I joined Hargrove Memorial Medical Center as attending physician of internal medicine in January 2012, on a base salary of $112,000, which was more money than my mother had earned in any 5 consecutive years of her working life. I did not think about that fact with bitterness. I thought about it with a kind of precise, private understanding, the same way you'd acknowledge the distance of a journey after you've completed it, not to punish anyone for not accompanying you, but to understand fully what the journey was. The department I joined was chaired by Dr. Constantin Varga, a Romanian-born internist who had been at Hargrove for 19 years, and ran the department with a combination of rigorous academic standards and a personal warmth that his patients described, consistently, in their care surveys, as feeling like being believed. He was the first supervisor I had in a clinical setting who treated intellectual confidence in a woman as a qualification rather than a liability. In my first performance review, 8 months into my attending position, he wrote, "Dr. Osaibansu's diagnostic instincts are among the most reliable I have observed at the attending level. Her capacity for constructing complete clinical pictures from fragmentary evidence is exceptional." I framed that review. Not on my office wall. I wasn't performing my achievement for an audience. I framed it and kept it in the bottom drawer of my desk at home, next to the folded page from the notebook I had kept at Colville Community College, on which I had written the trajectory in the handwriting you use when you want a thing to be permanent. By 2015, I was leading a department subcommittee on internal medicine protocols for patients with complex comorbidities. By 2017, Dr. Varga nominated me for the Hargrove Distinguished Clinician Award, an internal designation that, in practical terms, meant your name went in front of the hospital's medical executive committee when leadership decisions were being made. I did not win the award that year. I won it in 2018 and again in 2019, which had not happened before in the history of the award. The colleague who sat across from me during those years, my closest professional ally, the person who knew more about my clinical work than anyone except Dr. Varga, was Dr. Lenora Mwanga Cross, an internist of immense intelligence and dry humor who had joined the department 2 years after me and had, within 18 months, become the person I trusted most in any room at Hargrove. Lenora knew I had a family in Colville. She knew they did not know what I had built. She never asked me to explain this because she was one of the rare people who understood that private architecture has its own structural logic. "They'll find out," she said once, over coffee in the physician's lounge after a particularly long Tuesday. "They will," I said. "When you need them to," she said. That was the complete conversation. In 2019, Dr. Varga announced his retirement from the department chair position, effective the following March. The search committee for his replacement was internal. My name was submitted by Dr. Varga himself. I was interviewed in December 2019 and offered the position of Chief of Internal Medicine at Hargrove Memorial Medical Center in February 2020. The appointment came with a salary of $218,000, oversight of a department of 23 physicians, and, administratively, access to every patient record, every departmental document, and every institutional protocol produced by the Internal Medicine Department at Hargrove since 1989, including, as it happened, the complete medical file of every patient who had ever been admitted to or treated through our department, including the medical records of patients whose treating physicians had documented, with the precision that good medicine requires, every genetic screening, every paternity-adjacent diagnostic flag, every clinical note that would, under the right circumstances, constitute irrefutable evidence. The night I accepted the offer, I sat at my kitchen table for a long time without turning on the lights. My husband, James Osaibansu, who had been beside me through every year of the residency and the attending years and the long Tuesday evenings and all of it, James, who was the quietest and most constant presence in my adult life, brought 2 cups of tea and set them on the table without asking if I wanted one. He knew I did. "Chief of Internal Medicine," he said. "Chief of Internal Medicine," I said. We sat there until the tea was cold. I thought about a 19-year-old girl sitting at a dinner table in Colville, Ohio, watching her mother fold a letter and slide it back across the table. I thought about a folded piece of notebook paper that had lived, for 6 years, in the front pocket of every bag I owned. I thought about all of the things I had built in rooms that my family had never entered, and I felt, for the first time in a very long time, something that was not satisfaction and not triumph, but something quieter and more durable than either. Something closer to the feeling you get when you've been carrying something heavy for a very long time, and you finally set it down, not because you're tired, but because you've arrived. 3 months later, James was diagnosed with a rare autoimmune condition affecting his cardiac function. The prognosis was not good. We spent 8 months navigating specialist appointments, insurance policy reviews, medical expenses that arrived in envelopes that we opened together at the same kitchen table where we had celebrated. We organized his treatment through a combination of his employer's insurance policy, secondary health insurance coverage that we had maintained since 2014, and a financial cushion we had built over years with the guidance of our financial advisor, a careful woman named Sandra Acaffer Hughes of Meridian Wealth Partners in Columbus. James died on a Wednesday morning in April 2021. He was 47 years old. I was with him. The funeral was on a Saturday. My mother came. Lenora came. Several of my colleagues from Hargrove came, including Dr. Varga, who was retired but drove 3 hours to be there. Diane came with her husband and Carter, who was now 16 and taller than I remembered. At the reception, in the hour after we returned from the cemetery, while I was standing in my own living room accepting condolences from people who had known James and loved him, my sister Diane found me near the kitchen door. She was holding a glass of water with both hands, the way people hold things when they are about to say something they have been building up to for longer than the occasion. She said, "There's something I need to tell you," she said. "Carter is James's son." She said she needed me to know, and that she was sorry for the timing, but that Carter deserved to know his father's estate would include what was rightfully his. She said the word inheritance. I looked at her. I looked at Carter, who was across the room eating a sandwich with no apparent awareness of what was being claimed on his behalf. I looked at the glass of water she was holding with both hands. I thought about the complete medical file that existed in the administrative record system at Hargrove Memorial Medical Center, the one that documented every clinical encounter, every genetic screening, every diagnostic result associated with any patient who had passed through our department. I thought about what I knew about James's medical history, not as his wife, but as a physician who had read every line of his charts in the course of his final 8 months of specialist appointments and treatment protocols. I thought about the estate attorney, a careful and methodical man named Douglas Whitmore of the Whitmore Hale Group in Columbus, who had prepared James's will and his trust documents, and every instrument of financial disclosure that governed what James had built over a lifetime of quiet, careful work. I appreciate you telling me, I said. I excused myself. I went to my home office. I sat down. I opened my laptop. I pulled up the contact for Douglas Whitmore. And then I pulled up the secure Hargrove administrative portal, and I logged in with my chief of internal medicine credentials, and I navigated to the records archive. The medical file was exactly where it always is, complete, time-stamped, signed by treating physicians whose names I knew personally, whose clinical documentation I would trust in any court in any state. I had come that close to everything surfacing before it was time, but it wasn't time yet. I closed the laptop. I went back to my own living room, to my own guests, to the people who had come to honor my husband. I poured myself a glass of water. I stood near the window. I waited with the particular patience of a person who has spent 22 years learning that the truth does not require urgency. It was already there. It had always been there. All it needed was the right person to read it. The following Monday, I received a certified letter. It was forwarded to my office at Hargrove, which told me that Diane had looked me up professionally, had found the address, had used it deliberately, as a statement of intent dressed in the clothing of administrative process. The envelope was from a law firm in Columbus called Penderton and Brace, which I did not recognize, which told me Diane had retained someone new specifically for this. The letter was 4 paragraphs. The first paragraph established that Diane Calloway Morrow was acting as legal representative of her minor son, Carter James Sowers, in the matter of the estate of James Osibonsu, deceased. The second paragraph stated that Carter Sowers was believed to be the biological son of James Osibonsu, conceived during an ongoing relationship between the deceased and Diane Calloway Morrow, spanning from 2002 to 2009. The third paragraph requested a voluntary disclosure of all estate documents, including the will, all trust documents, and a complete financial disclosure of James Osibonsu's assets at time of death. The fourth paragraph noted that absent voluntary cooperation, Penderton and Brace was prepared to file a formal paternity and inheritance claim in the Franklin County Probate Court within 30 days. I read the letter twice. Then I set it face down on my desk, squared it with the edge of the desk pad, and picked up the phone. I called Douglas Whitmore. He answered on the second ring, which was characteristic of him. Douglas Whitmore was the kind of attorney who treated responsiveness as a professional value rather than a courtesy. I had worked with him since 2017, when James and I had first assembled the estate documents, and in 4 years of professional interaction I had never heard him flustered. I received the letter from Penderton and Brace, I said. I received a copy as well, he said. I was going to call you this afternoon. I want you to file a response, I said, and I want to begin the process we discussed. There was a brief pause. You're sure about the timing? I've been sure about the timing for 3 days, I said. That was the first document. I had 3 more. Douglas Whitmore's response to Penderton and Brace went out the following Wednesday. It acknowledged the claim, confirmed the existence of the estate, and notified Penderton and Brace that the estate of James Osibonsu was currently in active probate proceedings, with all relevant documentation properly filed, and that any paternity claim would be subject to the standard evidentiary requirements of Franklin County Probate Court, including independently verified biological evidence meeting the court's admissibility standards. It also included, in the final paragraph, a single sentence that Douglas had drafted and I had approved without modification. The estate executor respectfully notes that the decedent's complete medical records, including all genetic and diagnostic documentation generated during his treatment at Hargrove Memorial Medical Center from June 2020 through April 2021, are available through the relevant custodian of records and will be produced in their entirety in response to any formal discovery request. I was the relevant custodian of records. Penderton and Brace did not respond for 11 days. During those 11 days, I continued doing my job. That is the part of this story that is perhaps hardest to explain to someone who has not built their life around a discipline that requires your full attention regardless of what is happening in your personal life. The work does not pause for your private crises, and in a functional sense, neither do you. I saw 32 patients during those 11 days. I reviewed 11 department reports. I attended 2 medical executive committee meetings and chaired one. I supervised 3 residents whose work was exceptionally good and one whose documentation habits needed a direct conversation, which I had. On the 5th day, Lenora M. Wangacross came into my office at 7:15 in the morning, closed the door, set 2 cups of coffee on my desk, and sat down without asking if I had time for her. "Talk me through it," she said. "You know the outline," I said. "I know the outline," she said. "Talk me through the specifics. I want to understand what you're working with." So I told her. I told her about the letter and about Douglas Whitmore's response and about the medical records archive. I told her about what James's records actually showed, the genetic screening that had been conducted in August 2020 as part of his diagnostic workup for the autoimmune condition, which had included, as standard protocol for that diagnostic panel, a complete chromosomal and genetic profile. I told her about the documentation in James's file that was clinically unambiguous. "The records show a genetic marker for a hereditary condition," I said, "that is incompatible with Carter's biological profile." Lenora was quiet for a moment. "You've reviewed Carter's records?" she asked. "Carter was treated in our department in 2019, I said. "A referral for a specialist appointment. Pediatric specialist Dr. Yusuf Adiola in pediatric internal medicine. The records are in our system. And the comparison is definitive," I said. "Not probabilistic, not a matter of interpretation. The genetic documentation, read together, excludes James as Carter's biological father. Completely. There is no threshold of medical uncertainty here." Lenora picked up her coffee cup. She held it with both hands. "Does Diane know what's in those records?" she said. "I don't think she knows what James's records contain," I said. "She knows he was sick. She doesn't know the scope of the genetic workup. Does she know you have access to all of it?" "She knows I work at a hospital," I said. "I don't think she has thought carefully about what that means." "That was the moment I understood," Lenora said slowly, "exactly how much they have underestimated you." I looked at her. "That's exactly right," I said. She nodded. She picked up her coffee. She said, "What do you need from me?" "I need you to be available on the morning of the 15th, I said. "I've asked Douglas to schedule the probate hearing for that date. The court confirmed yesterday." "I'll be there," she said. "You don't have to, Miriam," she said. "I'll be there." We finished our coffee. She went back to her rounds. I went back to my charts. That evening, I called Sandra Akafor Hughes at Meridian Wealth Partners to confirm that James's retirement savings accounts, his investment property interests, and the secondary trust we had established in 2018 were all properly documented for the financial disclosure requirements of the probate proceeding. Sandra confirmed that the financial disclosure package was complete, that all accounts were properly titled, and that the trust documents clearly designated me as sole beneficiary and executor with no ambiguity regarding conditional distributions. If a paternity claim were to succeed, Sandra said, would the trust structure hold? "The paternity claim is not going to succeed," I said. There was a pause. "All right then," Sandra said. "Thank you, Sandra," I said. I signed the final probate disclosure document that night, transmitted it to Douglas Whitmore's secure portal, and sat at the kitchen table for a while in the dark. I thought about James. Not about the estate, not about the hearing, not about the documents, about James, who had driven me to the hospital on my first day as an attending physician, and had been standing in the parking lot at 7:45 in the morning, in his good coat, so that I would see a familiar face before I walked in. Who had never once, in 23 years, given me a reason to doubt him. Whose absence was a permanent alteration in the atmospheric pressure of every room I entered. I thought about what he would have said about all of this. I was fairly certain he would have made a very dry joke and then asked if I needed anything. I turned out the kitchen light and went to bed. Diane called me on a Thursday afternoon, 10 days after the certified letter. I was in my car in the Hargrove parking structure between a site visit and a department meeting when her name appeared on my phone screen. I looked at it for 2 rings, then I answered. "Miriam," she said. "I wanted to reach out directly, before it becomes official." "That's thoughtful," I said. "I want you to know I don't want this to be adversarial." Her voice had the particular quality of someone reading from notes they have memorized well enough to disguise. "Carter deserves to know his father, and what James left, some portion of it, a fair portion, rightfully belongs to his son. That's not about me, that's about what's right for Carter." "I understand," I said. "Douglas Whitmore is being very formal about everything, which I get, that's his job." but I was hoping that you and I could talk as sisters and come to some kind of understanding before the court gets involved. It would be better for everyone. What kind of understanding are you proposing? I said. She named a figure. It was $240,000, approximately 40% of the liquid assets of the estate, excluding the retirement savings and the investment property. She explained that she and her attorney had assessed the estate's approximate value and that this figure represented a proportional share for a biological child. She said it calmly, as though the figure had been calculated by someone reasonable using fair criteria. I kept my hands flat on the steering wheel. I appreciate you calling directly, I said. I'll ask Douglas to be in touch with Penderton and Brace about next steps. So you're open to it, she said, the smallest lift in her voice. The first time she sounded like herself. I'm open to the process, I said. Let Douglas and your attorney work through the details. Okay, she said. Okay, good, I think that's the right approach. Really, Miriam, I think we can make this work without it getting ugly. I do too, I said. We said goodbye. I sat in the parking structure for another 4 minutes. Then I drove to Douglas Whitmore's office, where I had a 4 o'clock appointment, and where I spent 90 minutes reviewing the complete evidentiary package that would be presented at the Franklin County Probate Court hearing on the morning of the 15th. She thought she had won. She had 2 more days. Douglas had prepared the file with the thoroughness that I had come to expect from him over 4 years of professional work. The probate petition was fully documented. The will was clear and properly executed. The trust documents designated beneficiaries without ambiguity. The financial disclosure included every account, every asset, every instrument of James's estate, organized by category and cross-referenced to source documents. And then there was the medical records package, which Douglas had formally subpoenaed through the court's discovery process, not because I lacked authority to access them, but because a formal subpoena meant they would enter the record with the full institutional weight of Hargrove Memorial Medical Center behind every page. He had worked with Hargrove's legal office to ensure the package was transmitted through the proper chain of custody. The package included James's complete medical file from his 2020-2021 treatment. It included the genetic screening results, the chromosomal profile, and the attending physician's notes documenting the scope and findings of the panel. It included, separately, the records from Carter's 2019 specialist appointment with Dr. Yusuf Adiola, submitted under the standard authority of the record's custodian. And it included a letter of clinical interpretation, signed by me, in my capacity as Chief of Internal Medicine at Hargrove Memorial Medical Center, explaining in plain language what the records showed, what the records excluded, and what degree of medical certainty attached to that exclusion. The letter was 2 pages. It was the most careful 2 pages I had ever written. The court has accepted all of it? I asked. The court has accepted all of it, Douglas said. The probate hearing was held in Courtroom 4B of the Franklin County Probate Court on the morning of November 15, 2021. The judge assigned to the matter was the Honorable Patricia Abamselli, a woman of approximately 60, with the posture of someone who has spent 30 years ensuring that rooms understand who is in charge of them. I arrived at 8:40. Douglas Whitmore arrived at 8:43. Lenore arrived at 8:50 and sat in the gallery section without announcing herself, which was exactly what I had expected. Diane arrived at 9:02 with her attorney, a man from Penderton and Brace named Graham Lattimore, who was perhaps 45, and carried his briefcase in the manner of someone who had won enough hearings to be confident without being careful. He was wearing a suit that was slightly too well-pressed for a probate courtroom, which told me something about his read of the room. Carter was not present. Diane had made that decision, which I thought was correct, and said something complicated about her. She was willing to claim on his behalf but not willing to expose him to a proceeding whose outcome she apparently considered uncertain enough to shield him from. I noted it, and I did not use it against her. My mother was present. She was sitting in the gallery 3 rows back, wearing her good coat, and she looked at me when I walked in with an expression I could not immediately read. Something between the confusion of seeing someone in 2 registers at once and the older, quieter thing underneath it, which I did not have time to examine. Also in the gallery, my colleague Dr. Fenwick Adami, who had driven from Cincinnati, which I had not expected, and which required me to look at the middle distance for a moment before I could proceed normally. Dr. Konstantin Varga, retired, who had apparently coordinated with Dr. Adami on the drive. Sandra Acaffer Hughes, who was present in her capacity as financial advisor to the estate. And 6 other colleagues from Hargrove's Medical Executive Committee and Internal Medicine Department who had chosen, without being asked, to attend. 23 people in total between the parties, the gallery, and the court staff. Judge Abumseli entered at 9:15. The room stood and sat. The hearing opened with Douglas Whitmore presenting the estate in probate, the will, the trust documents, the financial disclosure, the full accounting of James's assets. He was precise and unhurried. He named the retirement savings accounts, the investment property, the liquid assets, the secondary trust. He submitted the documentation to the court with the quiet efficiency of someone who has prepared the same kind of package many times and knows exactly what it contains. Graham Lattimore for Diane then presented the paternity claim. He was competent and organized. He established the alleged timeline of the relationship between Diane and James, years, dates, implied meetings, circumstantial proximity. He argued that Carter bore a physical resemblance to the deceased, which the court acknowledged as non-evidentiary but permitted him to state for the record. He argued that the absence of a prior denial by the deceased was itself suggestive. He was building toward a request that the court order independent genetic testing. Judge Abumseli listened to all of it without expression. Then she turned to Douglas Whitmore. Counsel for the estate has indicated the possession of medical documentation relevant to this claim, she said. Please proceed. Douglas opened the first file. He presented James's complete medical records from Hargrove Memorial Medical Center, the full clinical package, transmitted through proper chain of custody, authenticated by the institution's legal office. He walked the court through the 2020 diagnostic workup, the reason for the genetic screening panel, the scope of the testing, the clinical context. He was patient and methodical. Graham Lattimore was making notes. Diane was watching Douglas with an expression of professional calm that was very slightly too controlled, which I recognized as the expression of someone who is working harder than they would like to appear to be. Then Douglas presented the second document, the genetic profile from James's screening, with a brief technical summary prepared by the laboratory. Then the third document, Carter's records from the 2019 specialist appointment with Dr. Yusuf Adiola, produced through formal subpoena and authenticated through the same chain of custody. That was the first document, I had told Douglas, sitting in his office 2 weeks earlier. I have 3 more. The third was the comparative analysis. The fourth was the letter. He presented the comparative analysis, a side-by-side genetic assessment prepared by Dr. Marcus Obaitere, a clinical geneticist with independent credentials at Ohio State University Wexner Medical Center, whom Douglas had retained specifically to provide external validation of what the records showed. Dr. Obaitere had reviewed both files, prepared a written assessment, and was present in the courtroom, seated at a small table to the left of Douglas, to answer any technical questions the court might have. The assessment was 11 pages. Its conclusion was 4 sentences. Its final sentence was, to a degree of medical certainty consistent with the highest standards of clinical genetic science, the genetic profile of the decedent, James Osibonsu, is incompatible with biological paternity of the individual identified as Carter James Sowers. Graham Lattimore set down his pen. Diane's hands went still on the table in front of her. Douglas Whitmore presented the fourth document, my letter. 2 pages, signed by me, in my capacity as Chief of Internal Medicine at Hargrove Memorial Medical Center. He read the relevant section aloud, with the measured pace of someone who understands that precision requires time. The medical records of the decedent, he read, when reviewed in conjunction with the available records of the claimant's minor child, do not support, and in fact clinically exclude the claimed biological relationship. This assessment is made within the scope of my professional authority as Chief of Internal Medicine at Hargrove Memorial Medical Center, in accordance with the applicable standards of clinical documentation and medical interpretation, and I stand prepared to provide expert testimony to this effect if requested by the court. Judge Abumseli looked at the document. She looked at Dr. Obaitere, who confirmed, in response to her direct question, that the clinical genetics assessment was consistent with the medical records, and that his findings were reached independently of the estate's legal team. She looked at Graham Lattimore. Counsel, she said, Does your client wish to request independent genetic testing? Graham Lattimore looked at Diane. This was the only moment in the proceeding where I saw him look at her before speaking. He was, I understood, asking her a question without words. Do you know something about this that I don't? Diane was looking at the table. Counsel, Judge Abumseli said again. Graham Lattimore began. He stopped. He adjusted his posture very slightly. We would ask for a brief recess to confer with our client, Your Honor. You have 15 minutes, Judge Abumseli said. They went into the hallway. I stayed seated. I looked at the middle distance, the way I do when I am holding a great deal of information with appropriate care. Lenora caught my eye from the gallery and gave me a very small nod, the kind that means, I see you, and this is exactly what it was supposed to be. Dr. Ademi from the gallery said nothing. He simply sat with his hands folded, the way he had sat during 100 rounds in 100 hospital corridors, and his presence in the room was its own form of testimony. The recess lasted 11 minutes. When Diane and Graham Lattimore returned, she was walking with a slightly different quality of movement, the particular carriage of someone who has just had a conversation that clarified something irreversible. She sat down. Graham Lattimore stood. Your Honor, he said, the petitioner wishes to withdraw the paternity and inheritance claim. There was a quality of silence in the courtroom that was not dramatic in any theatrical sense. It was simply the silence of something becoming the historical record. So withdrawn, said Judge Abumseli. She made a notation. She looked up. The estate of James Osai-Bonsu will proceed in probate under the existing instruments. The will and trust documents are confirmed as presented. Financial disclosure accepted. The withdrawal of the paternity claim is recorded without prejudice. She looked at Diane directly, with the particular attention of someone who is making sure a person understands the weight of what they've just heard. The petitioner is reminded that any future claims arising from the same factual basis will be subject to the documentation produced in today's proceeding. She closed the file. Court is in recess, she said. I stood up. I straightened my coat. I picked up my folder. Douglas Whitmore was beside me in 2 steps and shook my hand once, firmly. Across the room, I could hear Graham Lattimore speaking to Diane in a low voice, professional, probably advising her on her exposure, probably explaining what the withdrawal meant for any future legal strategy. Diane was listening with her arms at her sides, and her face in a stillness that was, for the first time in my memory, entirely unperformed. My mother was standing in the gallery aisle when I turned around. She had her coat buttoned all the way up, the way she always did when she was uncertain about a room. She looked at me with the expression I had not been able to read when I walked in, and now I could read it. It was not confusion. It was not pride, exactly. It was the particular expression of a person who is recognizing, for the first time, the full distance between the person they thought they knew and the person standing in front of them. The gap between the letters she slid back across the table 22 years ago and this courtroom, this November morning, this version of me. She opened her mouth. I said, I'll call you this week, Mom. She nodded. I walked past her into the corridor. Lenora was waiting for me near the elevator. How are you? She said. Tired, I said. It was the most accurate word. Good, she said. You should be. We rode the elevator down together in the comfortable silence of 2 people who have known each other long enough not to fill every quiet moment. What happened to Diane after the hearing was institutional, documented, and proportional. Graham Lattimore's firm, Penderton and Brace, sent a formal communication to Douglas Whitmore acknowledging the withdrawal and noting that the firm had been acting in good faith on the basis of information provided by their client. That was their way of noting, for the record, that they had not known the claim was unsupportable when they filed it. Diane bore the legal costs of the proceeding, which Douglas's office billed against the claim's withdrawn status. The total she was ordered to pay in court costs and the estate's legal expenses was $22,400, confirmed by court order and payable within 90 days. She paid it. I don't know how, I didn't ask. Carter, as far as I am aware, was not told the full details of what occurred in courtroom 4B. He was 17. He had not chosen to make the claim. Those details belong to Diane and to her relationship with her son, and I have no part in them. My mother and I had a conversation on the phone 11 days after the hearing. It was 40 minutes long, which was longer than we had spoken in years. She did not apologize in any direct way, that was not in her vocabulary, and I was not waiting for it. She said, I didn't know. And I understood that she meant it as several things at once, that she hadn't known about Diane's claim, and that she hadn't known about James's illness, and that she hadn't known for 22 years what I was building and what it would become. I said, "I know you didn't." And that was as much of a conversation as we needed to have about it. Diane and I have not spoken since the hearing. I do not expect that to change, and I have made my peace with that expectation not as a wound but as a fact, the same way you make peace with any structural reality that has been present long enough to stop being temporary. My life at Hargrove continued. It continues now. I am still chief of internal medicine. My department has 23 physicians and 4 nurse practitioners, and we see approximately 4,000 patients per year. In 2023, the department received a grant from the Hartley Foundation, the same Hartley Foundation whose biomedical grant had funded my first semester at Fairbrook University, decades ago, which I noticed with the particular quiet amusement of someone who has learned to recognize the way stories rhyme with themselves. The grant funds a research initiative in internal medicine protocols for underserved patient populations. I chair the committee. We published our first findings in the spring of last year. Dr. Lenora M. Wanga-Cross was named Deputy Chief of Internal Medicine in early 2023. She is, without reservation, the most capable physician in my department and will be a better chief than I was when her time comes. She knows this. I have told her so directly, which she received with the particular grace of someone who has been told an accurate thing. Dr. Ademi is retired and lives in Cincinnati. He sends me a card at the end of every academic year with a brief handwritten note about whatever his most recent reading has been. Last year it was a paper on atypical inflammatory presentations in older adult populations, which was adjacent to the work we'd done together in residency. I wrote back. We had a brief correspondence. It reminded me of who I was before the titles. I keep 2 things in the bottom drawer of my desk at home: the framed performance review from Dr. Varga and the folded page from the Colville Community College notebook, on which I wrote, in the handwriting you use when you want a thing to be permanent, Crestfield University School of Medicine, Internal Medicine Residency, Department Chief. Everything on that page happened. James is not here, and that is the permanent weight that sits beneath all of it, the thing that no resolution in a courtroom can touch. I think about him most clearly in the small moments: the kitchen table, the 2 cups of tea, the sound of him moving around in the next room when I was working late. He was the most constant thing I ever built alongside, and his absence is its own form of presence. I have learned to work with that. You don't move past a loss like that. You learn to carry it in a way that leaves your hands free. I want to be honest about one thing, because honesty is the thing I have worked the hardest to protect in this account. What happened in Courtroom 4B was not the satisfying, clean resolution that stories sometimes offer. It was institutional and documented, and it was correct, and Diane was wrong, and the claim was false, and all of those things are true. But Diane is also a person who made a catastrophic decision from a place of I don't know. Desperation, maybe. A misreading of what she thought she knew. A belief that I would not be prepared, that I was still the girl at the dinner table watching my mother slide a letter back across to me. None of that makes what she did anything other than what it was. But I carry it without bitterness, because bitterness would require me to still be waiting for something from her, and I am not waiting for anything anymore. And if there's anything this experience taught me, it's this. 1. What you build in silence is protected from sabotage. The people who cannot see your work cannot interrupt it, and every year they underestimate you is another year you build without interference. 2. Documentation is not the language of cold people. It is the language of people who understand that truth requires a record, that the precise chart, the signed file, and the witness document are the most powerful forms of testimony that exist. 3. You are not defined by what your family believed you were capable of. You are defined entirely by what you decide to become in the years they were not watching. Was I wrong to keep my career, my title, and my access to those records completely hidden from my family for 22 years, and then use every bit of it, precisely and without warning, at the moment it mattered most? Tell me in the comments. If this story gave you strength, hit that like button. It means more than you know.